but it's still a very practical approach to building a partnership between your identity management team and your privacy program, your legal and privacy team. So I think it is still a very practical approach. It's still very much boots on the ground. So again, my name is Kevin Donahue. I work with Sentinel. Hopefully you saw Danielle's Keystone. At Sentinel, we turn complex privacy concepts and regulation into concrete requirements. Then we help you execute. So we really help businesses. We try to help businesses do privacy well. We don't just tell you CCPA says you have to have the access and delete and do not sell rights. Good luck. We really work with you to figure out what do you need to build in your business in order to actually be able to meet your privacy obligations wherever they come from, the privacy law, the regulations, contractual obligations, business goals, all that fun stuff. So I am talking about a partnership between identity management, legal and privacy, some foundational aspects of building privacy programs, and really how this partnership is really necessary to build these foundations of your privacy program. I'll talk about some core privacy concepts that you're probably all familiar with, even just kind of keeping up to date with what's happening with general privacy laws, but also I think a lot of them kind of meet your intuitive expectations of what privacy requires. And then just a practical approach to DSRs, which are data subject rights. And those are the right to access or delete or rectification or do not sell, all that fun stuff. What I'm not doing is I'm not giving legal advice. And I put this in red and I wrote this 3 times because it's kind of an inside joke for us, because while I am a lawyer, I don't work as a lawyer right now. I'm certainly not representing myself as giving legal advice. So please, and I say this like multiple times a day when I work with clients, you have legal departments. Really, the lawyers are the ones who will analyze the legal risk. But privacy is about dealing with privacy laws, and privacy operations is about doing the things in order to meet your privacy obligations. So you work very closely with your legal team. I am not a lawyer here. So I just want to talk about a very practical perspective to build this successful relationship. Really, I think your legal and privacy teams will ask your identity management teams to build things and to give capabilities in order to meet your privacy obligations. So it's really critical that your businesses understand across all of the data stores that you have, what is your concept of an identity in all of those data stores that you have? Do you have a consistent understanding of identity across these data stores, so that if somebody calls up and says, tell me what data you have about me, are you able to go to all these data stores and say, well, we've got your information in this database and this database for these different uses? So I just want to see, and I'm going to share my deck, hopefully with the attendees here, so my speaker notes will be included. So I want to take a quick drive down privacy law lane. GDPR and CCPA are currently the popular laws. There's several states and countries that are developing their own privacy laws. GDPR in particular and CCPA as well are really good representations of these modern privacy laws, all of which have a lot in common with each other. And we can look to GDPR and CCPA to get a really good feel for what will be included in really any modern privacy law. There are kind of industry-specific privacy laws like HIPAA for health information and financial regulations. These are generally carved out of what we generally refer to as privacy laws. So if you're thinking about CCPA, you don't have to make sure you've got complete HIPAA coverage and financial regulation coverage. They're generally carved out. So those do exist. Those do require their own expertise. The foundations of modern privacy law can be traced back to the Fair Information Processing Principles. These go all the way back to like the 70s and the 80s. And again, I think these would be pretty intuitively, they would really make sense to most folks who have been on the internet in the last 10 or 20 years. And I'm not going to read these to you, but you can see that they have to do with really the data that you collect, the quality of the data, the purpose of the data, security and openness, I think are the big ones. Really say what you do and do what you say. If you're going to be collecting information from individuals and using it for particular purposes, tell them what you're collecting and what you're using it for. And when you state those purposes, use it for those purposes. If you want to use it for another purpose, you kind of go back to the beginning of the analysis and you think, did I really kind of, follow these principles? Do I need to provide notice again for what I'm doing? Do I need to provide more data subject rights controls if I'm using it for another use or collecting more information? So I would certainly encourage you to go take a look at these fair information processing principles. They do form the basis of privacy rights. And I'm just going to use a few privacy rights when I talk today. The right of access, tell me what data you have about me. The right to delete, delete my data. Rectification, the data should be correct and accurate. Do not sell is included in the CCPA and some other privacy laws. So the thing with any of these laws, though, these data subject rights, is a business cannot respond to any of these requests without being able to find the information in all of the data stores that they have. And this is really where identity management comes into place. As I've worked for different companies, as well as a consultant, we've seen a whole range of cases where we've got very strong centralized identity management in a business, all the way through to businesses that have really no unifying concept of an identity. And obviously, my role is not to tell a business how to run their identity management teams or how to think about identity management, but to work with whoever kind of works with identity management and really think about what are the ways that you can propagate a request to access or delete or rectify or do not sell throughout all of your systems. And so this is, I would say, one of the fundamental aspects of the relationship between identity management and the legal and privacy teams is we can give you a very easy requirement, what you need to do, respond to an access request. Well, now we have to go throughout the whole business and figure out how we're going to do that. And you have to start off by doing like a data inventory and understand where all that data is. One of the key tenets is that you never want to inadvertently include another person's personal information in responding to a request from an individual. So, I don't want to use the word breach or incident. There's, I think, a difference between kind of a systemic problem and a kind of a one-off mistake. But really, when we're working with data subject rights, a key tenet is making sure that we have strong understandings of the data that I'm getting. The data that I'm getting actually belongs to this particular data subject. One aspect of data subject rights that we come across with clients a lot is that sometimes their systems are so diffuse and their systems have grown so organically that it's actually quite difficult to figure out where Kevin Donahue's data is. And this is another key aspect of the relationship with identity management is continuing to work throughout the business to make sure that you're onboarding every system that you find in a reliable way such that I know that if I'm looking for Kevin Donahue's data, I'm getting the correct Kevin Donahue's data. If we think about businesses that are kind of like purely online, like a company like Google, and not giving any state secrets away, Google's whole thing is that they know who you are and they provide you services online. And so identity is really kind of a core part of their product. If you think about something like a supermarket, though, where they have loyalty cards or reward cards, those are usually keyed just maybe to like a phone number. And you can share that really easily. You can go to the register and they can scan their own card if you forgot yours, or if you just don't want them collecting information about you. In that case, the identity as relates to that data collection is much lower fidelity than something like an online Google or a Facebook or something. And so if you were to go back to that business later and say, give me all the information you have about me, you're less likely to have a warm, fuzzy feeling that I know that this information is really the information about this particular individual. Because you do know that your normal practice kind of allows, data collection with a little bit less robust authentication system. So just be aware that depending on the type of business you have in the data collection processes, how you think about the identity of the individual in the database is going to really impact how you can respond to these requests for these data subject rights. And so any privacy program requires a very strong foundation, and two key aspects of that strong foundation are data identification and mapping, and then documenting your processing activities. This will be true for any privacy law, any privacy program. Even though the law itself doesn't say you have to have a data identification and mapping program, you cannot respond to data subject rights unless you do this. So like a few things in working with privacy, it's kind of a necessary precursor, even if it's not something that's actually in the law. And this is where, if you just looked at the law itself, you wouldn't really get, really concrete guidance on how to do privacy. If CCPA tells you you have an obligation to provide notice for all of the uses of personal information and all the PI that you're collecting, and that you've got to respond to an access request, but CCPA doesn't say you've got to do this work up front. Going into that blind, a business, a less sophisticated business might think, oh, I can probably just kind of set up a web page where somebody submits a request and then I can give them an answer. When in fact, it might be a lot more complicated, where actually finding that information throughout your systems would be difficult. I just want to take a quick sidebar here and talk about the spectrum of value and risk as it relates to personal information. And so personal information is defined, kind of broadly as information that is related to a particularly identifiable individual. And if there's a spectrum on how data can be associated with someone all the way to completely not associated, it can go from the left to right being personally identifiable information, personal information, pseudonymized information where you don't know that it was Kevin Donahue, you know that it was a person. You don't care what person, but you know that it was a person who perhaps took a series of actions. Anonymized data is just data where obviously some series of actions happened, you don't tie it back. Aggregated is just like counts, and then you just kind of destroy the data. So on my very rudimentary graphic here, on the left-hand side, you have personal information. The value is high because you can associate this with a particular individual, and so you can maybe monetize that. The risk is also high. There are bad actors who would love to take that personal information and do bad things, whether it's for data breach purposes, identity, stealing identities, that kind of thing. The further you go along towards aggregated data or destroyed data, the lower the value, but the safer it is. You have some more protections against bad actors doing something bad with that data. So one thing we encounter a lot when we work with clients is CCPA has a right of deletion. Somebody can request that you delete their data. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to destroy the data. And so we work with teams, product teams, identity management teams, marketing teams, what have you. And we think, how can the business still maintain some value in having some data while also trying to minimize privacy and security risk? And one way you can go about that is you can pseudonymize or anonymize or aggregate data. From a practical perspective, this tends to break databases. If you say that you want to start mucking about with some records and tables, you will have a lot of production problems. So we work with all of these different stakeholders within the business to figure out how they really need to use this information, what they're using it for, and how they can possibly transform it in order to minimize privacy and security risk. This is never a quick and easy solution. And so it is always kind of a long-term thing that we have to help plan and help execute. It involves data scientists to figure out what does it truly mean to anonymize data. And there is actually a NIST identification standard that I should probably add a link to here before I share this, which discusses some ways that you can go about making it a little bit safer to share and store information that is starting off as personal information. You can minimize the likelihood of someone being able to look at a record and say, I can figure out who that person actually is. It is a data scientist role. That is not a role that, like, for instance, myself, I would commit to. So that's another partnership. You also have to work with teams like marketing and product teams to make sure that the data is being transformed in a way that they can still derive value from. You obviously have to work with your data warehousing team, your identity management team, to make sure that you've got the appropriately structured databases that can actually support these records that you may be proposing get transformed. So how businesses prioritize data collection and analytics influences how identity management intersects with legal and privacy teams. So I had mentioned that there are some businesses like kind of Google or Facebook or something where they're arguably kind of purely online. Identity management is probably actively engaged in the data warehouse design. They're probably key players in really figuring out any data that we store is probably going to be associated with an individual, and we probably have a pretty good idea who that individual is. And particularly for a company that relies on login, you can probably be pretty sure that whenever I log on to my Google account that I am me. And there's all sorts of forensics that these companies can run, obviously, Is the behavior somewhat different? Am I logging in from a different device or a different location? It's arguably somewhat sophisticated, sophisticated methods to make sure that I am who I say I am. So, IAM probably has pretty good institutional knowledge of how to identify my data throughout their systems because it is a core part of the product. And as I mentioned, something like a brick and mortar business would be probably a little bit less rigorous about this. And you can probably have a little bit less reliability that when you go into their databases, they can be sure that I am, that information has been collected from the individual that I said I was. This isn't to say that larger tech companies have an easy time at implementing and deploying privacy programs. Quite the opposite, as many of you probably are familiar with as much as I am. Everyone has challenges with identity management and privacy. And I think one of the reasons is because a lot of these companies and data collection has grown kind of organically because, part of the deal with using the internet was obviously we can collect your personal information and we'll give you really cool products. And, aside from kind of the creepy surveillance nature of the society, I think that's reasonably true. But that does mean that companies have had whole armies of developers and product managers, for instance, saying, oh, we've got this really valuable data. We could do something really cool with that. Well, let me spin up a database over here. Let me make copies of this data and this data and this data. I'm going to bring it over here so that I'm not impacting those production systems. And I want low latency. And I want to kind of control how this data gets transformed later on. And so you have these very complex data flows throughout your organization. Now, maybe you've got a strong centralized identity management team where there is kind of a culture of sticking to maybe some sort of identity standards so that, sure, anybody can spin up their own databases, but we've got standards for how you're going to identify the data there because we want it to be useful across our organization. In that case, the privacy and legal teams would probably partner with identity management and figure out a way to propagate signals whenever somebody asserts a data subject right, an access request or a delete request. If we've got a centralized identity management team, we can work with them to create a signal that they can propagate to these other systems. And now you just have to worry about building the sub-processes that can say, when I see an access request, it's probably going to be tagged with some sort of identifier. I query my database and I feed it back to that, whatever that privacy pipeline is. And I'm clearly oversimplifying here. Now, if you don't have a strongly centralized identity management team, you've still got to do the work to go through and figure out where all those databases are. And you're probably going to have to do the work to figure out how are you going to integrate them into your privacy pipeline. This might mean that you've deploying some sort of technical solutions where you've got some sort of orchestration of software that you simply have to feed it the databases and the credentials and when it can go there and what it can do. It might mean that you've got an army of program managers and database administrators who are working with a ticketing system, who they receive a ticket that says Kevin Donahue with this email address submitted a request. You've got to go through your database and kind of figure what you have here and some sort of secure way that I can aggregate all that information within our systems, somehow get that back to the user. Regardless of the level of sophistication and regardless of how well identity management is tied to all of your databases, you always have to figure out a way to kind of get this information. So it's nice when there's a centralized identity management team. It kind of gives you a chain of command. It gives you kind of a smaller number of points of contacts. And hopefully you can leverage your investment in building something once and having that get propagated easily. But we live with the world as we get it, not as we wish it to be. Yes, move my screen around a little bit here. And so how have GDPR and CCPA strengthened the need for identity management and legal and privacy to take the lead in product and program design? I do think that I'm a huge fan of privacy by design. And I think we saw that keynote this morning. I think privacy by design is probably more valuable than data subject rights. And I was brought around to that idea by my colleague, Aaron Weller, who's kind of a leading light in the privacy industry. And I think it really makes sense. And I think it was mentioned, I think Danielle mentioned in her keynote that when jurisdictions pass privacy laws and they give you these data subject rights, it's entirely possible that the privacy problem has already happened and the data subject right will just bring that privacy problem to light. When you submit an access request, you might be shocked at the amount of data that's collected about you. When you submit a delete request, you'll expect all of that information to be deleted. And if you receive a marketing email 2 months later, something went wrong there, and that the privacy harm is kind of happening. Privacy by design is, I think, the way that identity management can really partner with legal and privacy teams to say, we do have these obligations from these privacy laws. The foundation of these privacy laws is to know that the data I collect, to know who it belongs to know how it's being used, to allow people to assert their rights, to know that if, our business says we're collecting these pieces of personal information to do these things, to know that that is actually true. And if that changes, that's okay. You just have to go through all of the steps. And so clearly identity management plays a key role in this from a product design point of view. If I can build infrastructure that people get for free, if I can kind of centralize identity management, putting aside obviously any security concerns and product concerns and cost concerns, obviously, from a privacy perspective, maybe I do want to be able to say, well, everyone uses this centralized identity service. That way we can propagate these data subject rights requests, and we can kind of, I don't want to say no, but we can be reasonably certain that if people are following this process, we can tell regulators we're doing a pretty good job with privacy. We're doing a pretty good job understanding the way that the data flows throughout our system because we enforce this centralized identity management. If you don't have that capability, perhaps you can still influence your organization by saying, we are all responsible for responding to these data subject rights. We're all responsible for making sure that we're saying what we do and doing what we say. And perhaps you can propagate standards. You can provide kind of internal consulting services to these teams so that when they do spin up databases, they know that they should do so in a way that can integrate with your privacy pipeline. But really what I would say to kind of anybody involved in this from an identity management point of view, from a legal and privacy point of view, is to really think about how you would handle someone calling up and asserting an access or a delete right. Assuming you actually want to comply with that, how would you think about how you interact with your business? How do you provide guidance throughout your business? How do you try to influence the way that products are developed? If you consider privacy from the beginning, if you think about some privacy by design concepts, then not only do you build a better product for your users, you actually make it easier for your business to meet your privacy obligations. And so putting some of these together here, putting the pieces of your privacy program together. So we can think about your privacy program in a very rudimentary way, relating to data subject rights. If you think about the front end, which is the way that people will submit their data subject rights requests. It could be a web page, it could be an email address, it could be a phone call to customer service, it could be a physical letter. GDPR in particular doesn't really specify the manner in which people are obligated to submit requests. So if you want to write a letter to the president of the company, that's probably something they're going to have to deal with, which I think is kind of insane, but this is the world we're in. So the front end, how people can submit DSRs. In the back end is my shorthand for understanding the data that you hold. The back end is once somebody says, delete my data, the back end is everywhere where that data can reside, and how do you get to it? How do you know how to identify this particular Kevin Donahue? It's a common name. How do you know that as new databases come online, they're kind of integrated into your privacy pipeline? Just thinking about the front end here, pairing into the computer. As I mentioned, data subject rights requests can be submitted in a number of ways, up to including sending a letter sometimes. Although CCPA is a little bit better about this. It kind of says you can mandate how it happens. So you really want to think about how your business interacts with your users and customers, the technological resources you have available, the time and the money available, as well as what your users expect. Something like Google, it makes sense to be able to log into your account and press a button and say, do something with my personal information, give me my personal information. Something like the supermarket down the road, maybe they could develop some sort of web portal, but I don't do, well, now that we have COVID-19, I actually do a lot of my shopping online, but I don't really, before, 3 months ago, I wouldn't have expected to have done that. And I would expect I should probably go down there and say, tell me what information you have about me. Maybe Lowe's or Home Depot or something. So somebody wants to submit an access request. There's a few common questions you really need to answer before you take any action on that. And again, I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm not developing your privacy program now. But this is kind of the rudimentary things you'll think about. A regular authentication problem. Is this the person they say they are? You know, as I mentioned before, if I log into Google, I'm probably who I say I am. If I'm filling out a web form, you know, you maybe have a little bit less surety that I am the person I say I am. So think about how the person is interacting and how you would actually verify who they are. How do you verify their ID safely, reliably, and in a way that they would expect, in a way that the regulators would expect? Are you putting up roadblocks? Are you making this so hard that people will tend to fail? There are third-party identity validation services out there, and they do a great job. They solve a critical problem. But sometimes people can't do it. I probably couldn't answer what the major intersection was near the home I lived in 1992. Well, maybe I could, but I spent a lot of my life there. But you know, they go through public records and they try to ask you a question that's reasonably probably only answerable by you. But sometimes people just can't answer those questions. And if a regulator were to look at that and say, you know, it seems like this is unnecessarily difficult and you seem to be putting up kind of a barrier, you know, that might lead to some sort of regulatory inquiry, and they would probably give you a little bit of scrutiny. Also, you'd probably have unhappy customers, and we often say that, you know, happy customers probably don't complain to regulators, and so you probably do want to do something that your users and customers expect in a way that they interact, in a way that you can kind of, you know, as a normal course of business, understand that they're probably who they say they are. Something for submitting requests online, for instance. Well, you probably know who I am if I log into my account with my password. But what if I submit a request and then I say, well, I want you to send it to a different email address or a different physical address? You know, that brings up a question of, did somebody maybe kind of guess my password or otherwise, you know, hack into my account? And are they trying to inappropriately access my personal information? And so even though you've authenticated me to a degree of certainty, there may be other actions taking place that say, well, this is kind of maybe suspicious behavior. So maybe you don't want to allow someone to do that. Maybe if someone logs into their account, you're pretty sure you've authenticated them. You know, you'll submit an access request to the email that you've had on file, for instance. You know, this isn't specifically mentioned in any privacy law. It's just one of those kind of reasonable security measures that you're kind of obligated to perform. It also is in the business's best interest, obviously, to maintain user trust. So just kind of thinking about the method where people are submitting their requests. What happens if they fail? How hard is it for them if they can't use the first method that they want to submit by? Are there other ways you can partner with your identity management team and think about, you're always authenticating the identity of the person in the context of the data that you have. And so are you collecting the correct pieces of information so that when you say you've got the right Kevin Donahue, you've collected those pieces of information that will allow you to go into your database and find my data. If you have a notary public come to my house and say, I've verified that he's living in this house, but then all of your data in your databases is keyed by my social security number and my email address, horrible, I know. Well, you haven't really collected the information and verified me in a way that really allows you to service the data subject rights request. So not only are you authenticating the identity, you're doing so in a way that allows you to go through your systems and find that personal information. And this one is a fun one. CCPA allows you to nominate someone to assert some of your rights, to submit an access request for you or something. And you just need to make sure that you're authenticating the identity of the correct person when one person is submitting a request on behalf of another. Make sure that you're always authenticating the identity of the data subject, the person about whom the data relates. But sometimes you also have to validate that the person is actually authorized to take this act. And so just sometimes you do have to split up the authentication authorization thing in this quote on behalf of situation. It doesn't seem to happen too often, but I just thought it was a fun one to think about. And so going to the back end where all the data is. As I mentioned before, identity management is really key in trying to make sure that for any database or data source that you have personal information in, you have a concept of an identity so that you know when somebody asserts their right, these are the pieces of information we need to gather from them in order to find them in our database. And it would be nice in some ways if every database was kind of homogeneous and that we knew that we had consistent keys for identity and we could easily just kind of run some queries. In the real world, that's not really too practical. So, I would say that just when you're developing your privacy program, when you're partnering with identity management and legal and privacy, just think about how many data sources there really are throughout your business. Even if you think you have like, well, we've got like an SAP system and that's kind of it. You've probably got hundreds or thousands of tables in there that different people have created for different reasons. And really think about what happens if I have to go through all of those tables. Where are they? Who owns them? How are they being used? How is the data being used in there? What pieces of data are actually in there? And how do you identify a particular individual's data in each of these? And then finally, how do you integrate all of these things in your DSR workflow? One word I'd like you to remember is prioritization. You probably don't have infinite time and infinite money and infinite resources. So you often have to look at all of the data stores you need to integrate into your data subject rights workflow and prioritize them. Are there some data stores that you can categorize as kind of the authoritative sources, and are some of them copies? And it might be that if you've got 100 data stores, you can integrate 10 of those or 20 of those. And that the other 90 or 80 of those are maybe duplicative. And it's a little more complicated than this, obviously, but this is just kind of the one way you can think about how do we prioritize integrating these systems. We've got a looming deadline. We've got competing priorities in our business. And so it's not necessarily that it's an all or nothing failure or success. It's that, we try to do privacy well. We try to do what we can within the limitations of the business. We try to always tell a good privacy story that we understand the data that we hold, the uses we're putting it to. We have a concept of an identity in all of those data stores. We have a plan to integrate them with our DSR workflow. We think that we've prioritized them in a reasonable way because we want to do privacy well in terms of our users and clients. We've given them the most valuable information. And so there are always these trade-offs that you have to do when you're developing your privacy program. And so that's a wrap. So I just want to sum it up. Identity management and legal and privacy partnerships work, and it's a critical part of doing privacy well at your business. And as a privacy professional, I've been a developer, I've been a program manager, I've been kind of all around it, and I think that this is one of those privacy concepts where identity teams play a key role in having legal and privacy be able to identify and mitigate privacy legal risk. And so identity management is a key player in that. Understand your data and how to target a specific individual throughout all of your systems. It's an incredibly daunting task. There's a lot of ways you can go about it. Think about the pseudonymization, anonymization, and aggregation spectrum. How can you maintain value of data while also trying to minimize that privacy and security risk? Modern privacy laws have a lot in common. There's a lot of infrastructure that you can build once and use many times. Implementation matters in each privacy law, but there are a lot of underlying concepts and tooling that you can create that will allow you to satisfy your privacy obligations across a lot of jurisdictions. And there are no silver bullets. There is no one solution you're going to buy that's going to do privacy for you. There are a lot of privacy vendors out there that do a lot of really, really good things. They solve a core critical piece of your privacy puzzle, but it is a puzzle. There are generally many pieces. And I would just encourage you to really think about, and I think I put this in my speaker notes, really carefully think about those different pieces of the puzzle, solve those individual problems, and make sure that they play well together. That's, I think, probably a better bet than trying to fit a one-size-fits-all solution. So with that, I thank you.